So welcome everybody. My name is Jason Foster. I am the director of Parkland Institute, and we're very happy to be able to host this webinar on Parkland's latest report, which we released just this morning. So it's brand new, hot off the e-presses, as it were. Before we get going, I would like to acknowledge the Parkland Institute and most of us here today are primarily located on the territory of the Niiwa, Natsappi, Métis, Nakota, Dene, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe lands that are now known as part of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, as well as the homeland of the Métis. But I think more than just acknowledging the land and the peoples who have been here for tens of thousands of years, if we were really to act in the true spirit of reconciliation, we need to find a way to incorporate this understanding of land, this understanding of place and what it means into all of our activities. And so, thinking of today, we're here to talk about municipal finances of the city of Edmonton. We're going to get involved in numbers and politics and that kind of thing. And it's easy when doing that kind of thing to forget that as we go through our day-to-day lives, whether we go to work, go to school, or go to a city of Edmonton recreational facility, we are in a place. We are interacting with that place. We are relying upon that place. And we need to then be conscious of the fact of what are we giving back, not just to the land in a physical sense, but to the place as an entity in which we reside. So with that, hopefully we can kind of keep that in our heads as we have our discussion in the next hour about the more sort of practical matters of finances in the city of Edmonton. So for those of us who don't know us, the Parkland Institute is housed at the University of Alberta. We are a public interest research institute. Our goal is to create research and policy alternatives for the public good. In a range, we do research in a range of policy areas related to Alberta, Canada, and the world. In this particular report, we're focusing, specifically on the city of Edmonton and its municipal budgeting. It's a particularly relevant time for that. Because we are entering, for example, the last year of Edmonton's multi-year budget cycle. So there will be some major decisions that need to get made in the next year or so around what happens in the next few years of finances in the city. We know, all of us I think are well aware, and as we'll go on a little bit about this, is the financial, social, political climates have changed significantly in recent years and even recent months in many cases. And of course, finally, we're going into an election year. In Edmonton. In less than a year, Edmontonians will be going to the polls to elect a new mayor and city council. So we felt the time was right to explore evidence-based alternatives for how we can deal with Edmonton's fiscal challenges, and of which there are many. And so today we've launched and are happy to have our report author here. We've launched Shifting Gears, Exploring Edmonton's Financial and Political Pressures and Ways Forward. And so before I introduce our author and speaker, I'll just give you a little bit of a sense of the day of the next hour. So Inez will talk for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll open things up to a Q&A. Because this is a webinar, Zoom, I'll explain after her talk how you can ask questions, and I'll facilitate that question and answer with Inez. And then we promise to have you done by 1 o'clock, because many of you probably have to go back to work or do other things. So without further ado, let me introduce Inez. Inez Hillel is the president and economist at Vittek Research Incorporated. It's an economic and policy research firm. Her work generally focuses on intersectional economics, emphasizing frontline voices and qualitative data as the foundations for progressive policy development. She completed her master's degree in economics at Simon Fraser University and received a BA from the Queen's University. She is currently a master's student at the University of Manitoba in individual interdisciplinary studies in the departments of economics, city planning, and sociology, which can make you appreciate why she is the perfect person to be doing this report for Parkland. And without further ado, I will hand things over to Inez.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for being here today. And thank you, Jason, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and to start us off, the research was really focused around trying to think through what alternatives exist for the city of Edmonton right now because of the numerous challenges that the city currently faces. And to do this research, we started by talking to people. So we talked to union presidents, we talked to city councilors, we talked to advocates in the city and people that are really involved at the municipal level. And the resounding responses that we got from people was that they felt that all levels of government were really effectively not grappling with the severity of the crises that they're being faced with, and essentially coming up with short-term solutions that aren't really seeing the results and continuing these conditions of crisis. So effectively, people pointed to challenges that aren't particularly unique to the city of Edmonton. So they talked about homelessness, they talked about drug toxicity crisis, which we're seeing, across jurisdictions in Canada. And then they even spoke to global challenges like climate change and broader economic trends, but then really bringing it back to the municipal level, because that's where people are truly experiencing that day-to-day reality. So people are thinking of their own experiences, struggling and making decisions around rent and other purchases around food, Wi-Fi, and so on, or their own experiences being unhoused and having to rely on city services, and what that creates at a municipal level, and what that means for everybody who's having to make these decisions. So one of the common themes that kept coming up was this idea that levels of government are kicking the can down the road. And that's really an important part of this report. So why it's called Shifting Gears, in terms of thinking about how we can put an end to that and what a more transformative budget could look like in the coming years. Just in terms of what people are seeing and sharing in the conversations that we had as part of this research were really echoed in the media. So this is probably not new information in terms of the challenges that the city faces, but these were just resounding and compiling crises that are being faced. So I guess starting us here today, some of the most recent news that's coming out of the city is around the budget choices that are being made right now. So the two options that are being put forward are either further property tax increases or service cuts. And that reality happens because the city doesn't have too many new options in terms of how they can raise revenue. So working within what they have, they also have these challenges. So people are coming to city council with concerns around the cost of living, and admittedly, not every challenge that's brought to the city is within the city's possibility to fix, but as the most accessible level of government, they're going to be the ones on the front line having to address those concerns being brought forward from residents. At the same time, population at Edmonton is growing rapidly. So the increased demand for service is coming both from people turning to the city in need of support, but also just from having new residents in the city of Edmonton. That's growing demand. And then broader challenges that are brought on by policy choices at other levels of government. So the surge in homelessness in Edmonton is at its highest levels today since 2009. And then as well, looking at previous trends, homelessness is higher in the city of Edmonton than it was 10 years ago as well. And a lot of this, there's a lot of evidence-based research that points to federal policy choices that have created the conditions that we see today, from the divestment in social housing in the 1990s. At the same time, when that funding isn't coming through at a federal level, the city is where that crisis ends up playing out, and it's city services that end up taking on that responsibility. So at the same time, thinking through crises around drug overdoses and the drug toxicity crisis, we can think of the challenges between evidence-based solutions and more short-term immediate solutions that have been suggested at the city, and what that means in terms of costs. So thinking of, federal legislation that governs drug regulation, while balancing that with the immediate need to respond and how that's being met by fire, paramedics, and police. At the same time, and then this brings in really one of the core themes that came up in the research that we did, was the relationship between the municipality and the province. So that strained relationship. We were hearing, that it had disintegrated over the past few years, that people felt that it was dysfunctional, that people weren't seeing positive avenues to move forward in collaborative ways. But the reality is that municipalities are governed by provincial legislation, and that collaboration is necessary, both from a funding perspective and from a policy perspective. And then once again, just bringing forward the challenges that residents bring to the city, that implicitly the city has to decide how they want to navigate. So just like through our research, we're coming up with more and more of these like city level concerns. And really to a point where it can feel overwhelming, right? Like short-term solutions are being suggested. At the same time, people are hoping for these more long-term responses. So then we ended up shifting from looking at the challenges the city faces towards their finances. So thinking of city expenditure is, I think, a helpful way to start in terms of thinking, how has the city responded to the challenges that they face? And effectively came up with a rather disappointing conclusion, which is the overall picture of how the city has been spending over the last, this is a 14-year trend, hasn't changed considerably. So this figure that is up on the screen is total spending, so both operating and capital. Operating spending being spending on daily operating costs of the city, so thinking of like wages, and then on the other hand, capital spending being long-term purchases like assets and infrastructure. But the proportions of how that money is allocated hasn't changed drastically. So when we talk about drastic increases in homelessness, we're not seeing that being reflected in drastic increases in public housing spending. Part of this is because those responsibilities lie elsewhere than the municipal level, but then the reality is that the municipality is having to address them. At the same time, we can see pretty considerable funding is allocated to public transit and to roads, but that isn't necessarily matched with people's experience of how that service is. And then lastly, what we see is continuous funding to reactive services, so like fire and police that respond in times of crisis, but we don't see a same investment in preventative services and preventative responses. Moving into more a focus on revenues, I thought this was important to talk about a second, because essentially the expenditures choices that are being made are constrained by what revenue the city has. And revenue sources at a municipal level are constrained by the Municipal Government Act, which is provincial legislation that determines how the city can raise revenues. As it currently exists, the primary ways are property taxes and user fees. And other like broader changes would require this legislative change that would happen with provincial collaboration to the Municipal Government Act. So when we're looking at revenue sources over time, the first one that I want to draw everyone's attention to is property taxes. So property taxes, and again, this is of total revenue, so revenue that goes into funding operating and capital budgets. Property taxes is the main source of revenue. And in this context, because it is total revenue, it comes out around 42% in 2023. But when you're thinking of property tax funding daily operations in the operating budget, it is closer to 60%. And what we can see is that property tax revenue has increased considerably in this trend over time. So in the last 14 years, there's been about $2 billion in revenue that's been added to municipal budgets, and 1.1 billion of that has come directly from property tax. An equally and extremely important trend is provincial government transfers. So what we can see here is that government transfers as a percentage of total revenue have decreased over time. So between 2009 and 2023, government transfers now make up 10% less of total revenue that they did in the past. And if we look to the actual dollar amounts, it's not as clear on the graph just because of the scale, but in 2023, the city of Edmonton received $9 million less than they did in 2009. And so this isn't accounting for the fact that population has grown or for the fact, or accounting for inflation. So what we're seeing is that the dollar per person, so this per capita spending from the provincial government on people living in Edmonton has declined considerably. And that is one of the key sources that is putting strain on the city. And what we're seeing is that happens in two ways. So one, there's just less dollars coming in from the provincial government, but at the same time, there's also more responsibility that's being put on the municipality's plate that they're having to respond to within these funding constraints. And that trend, although a financial trend, also speaks to the broader relationships between the municipality and the province. Because that collaboration piece is so important, when we see a decrease in funding, and then that's coupled with, people confirming and reaffirming that the relationship is deteriorating, it suggests that common solutions that'll be put forward that require provincial support are going to be a lot harder to meet than they would have been in the past. In terms of making up for that funding that's being lost at a provincial level, we see a small increase in government transfers from the federal government, which the colors can be a little bit hard to see, but then this yellow mustard, I'm not going to venture to suggest what color that is. But we see that federal government transfers have increased over the same time frame. And then just drawing slight attention really quickly to developer agreements. So this is money brought in by new developments. You can see as a percentage of total revenue, it is quite a small source of funding. So also thinking, this will feed into the next slide, but thinking, is this, a lost opportunity or an underutilized opportunity for revenue? Which brings us to this slide, but essentially the city is navigating, as I mentioned, a number of challenges, but on a revenue side, they're both grappling with having constraints to how they raise money, but then also having to spread that money thin. So we've talked about it from a perspective of, meeting service delivery need, but then also not only from population growth, but on the expansion of the city's boundaries through urban and suburban sprawl is where we see resources at the city level being severely spread thin. So in terms of thinking of decisions around, population growth, which bring in a conversation about access to housing and particularly affordable housing, building new infrastructure becomes increasingly important, but the choices of where that happens, so either in an area where you're going to need expansions to transit, new libraries, new recreation centers, and so on, versus, densifying your city core, where presumably an increase in services will also incur some costs, but won't bring on the same amount of new infrastructure that's required. Thinking through the perspectives of debt, because that's largely what funds a capital budget, your daily expenditures can't be funded through debt. So you have to have a balanced city budget, which is another one of the challenges that the city faces of right now. They need to match all of their revenues to their expenditures. That isn't true for from a capital perspective where the city can borrow. But right now, the city of Edmonton, although it borrows considerably more than they have in the past, is still borrowing below their debt limit and could effectively be raising additional revenues through that mechanism. The recommendations became a core focus of the report because with the timeline that we were thinking through, so we know that adjustments to the budget are coming and those conversations are happening right now, but in the following year, a new multi-year budget will be put forward. And effectively what we were hoping to start a conversation on or continue a conversation about is what that budget could look like in a way where it's no longer band-aid solutions in conditions of crisis, but really looking to address the root causes. And so one of the big and primary recommendations that we came through with this report is reforms to the Municipal Government Act. And The challenge, and this isn't to undermine the challenge that this recommendation actually suggests because of the strained relationship with the province and the potential implications of bringing back and increasing autonomy at the municipal level, does open up a whole conversation around like what new tax revenues can be brought in at the city level. But one of the potential new revenue sources that can be brought in following changes to the Municipal Government Act is progressive property taxes. And property tax is such a big topic of conversation right now for good reason. But a progressive property tax does effectively help address some of the main concerns that people bring forward. So the way property tax currently works, people pay a fixed rate. Everybody pays the same property tax rate, but under progressive property tax would operate similar, and like specifics of it can depend, but to income tax, where you have income brackets, and the higher your income, the higher your tax rate on that additional income. So concerns around people living on fixed income who own their homes, a lot of that can be mitigated by how that policy is introduced, but it does open up new opportunities of having more equitable ways of raising revenue while still relying on property tax at a municipal level. Similarly, a recommendation around prioritizing substantial completion over urban sprawl, or as a way to reduce urban sprawl, in terms of not wanting to spread what limited resources are available at the municipal level thin over growing region where new infrastructure is required. And then this third recommendation, which I think potentially for this coming budget cycle is going to be the most important one, is creating pathways for city workers to create efficiencies. So generally, efficiencies is understood to refer to cuts, and that is something that's going to be on the table for this budget cycle and in like coming years. So recognizing that it isn't always possible to have both. Well, it isn't possible to have low taxes and high service delivery when the revenues that the city is bringing in isn't adequate to meet that demand. So if we know that the city is going to have to navigate some level of cuts, having those cuts be suggested and brought forward by the expertise that exists at the city level, which is really in the hands of the worker, is going to be critical. So as the people that carry out that work on the day-to-day, they're best positioned to understand what work that they do can be the work that they do can be like best navigated, like with having the least negative impact. Sorry, I was getting distracted in my thoughts. But to me, that's really something that we would want to look at, because this is something that can also be introduced at a short term. So also recognizing that some of these recommendations are going to take are going to take a long time to implement. And that's because a lot of them require like long-term conversations and are going to involve multiple stakeholders, different levels of government, and different interests, both like within the municipality and outside of it. So then thinking through other recommendations that we have, in terms of increasing transparency, this is a recommendation that I think will exist in a lot of reports around the city level, because it's that first level of government with which residents interact. And they interact with the city not always through their elected official or through city staff, right? People engage directly with the city through city workers. And so ensuring that people have information around the choices that are being made is critical in terms of garnering support for those choices. Okay, I know I only have 4 minutes and there are 8 recommendations in this report, so I'm going to skip to the 6th recommendation. These are all elaborated on more in the report, but interrogating the logics that underlie city's current spending is something that came up a lot, because there are existing tensions between how the city spends and the city's long-term goals that they're putting forward. So thinking of city documents like the city plan and Vision 2050 that chart the ways that the city wants to become an increasingly equitable city and a city for all, has to negotiate with how the city is currently choosing to spend, under the, like, recognizing the constraints that they currently face. And then the 7th and 8th relationship in this report focus on city workers, just because of the importance that labor plays, I mean, at a municipal level and then all levels of government. But the relationship between city workers and city management is something that in the past had come up time and time again during this research process as something that had been undermined through a lack of transparency and then a lack of trust that exists between parties. And we see the impacts of that because city workers are being asked or are implicitly required to do the work that is brought on by this downloading from other levels of government and through resources being spread then at a municipal level. So working towards that, and I think we see a lot of hope, and we saw that throughout these consultations in like what that can look like for the future and what possibilities that opens up, but really centering the knowledge of city workers and shifting away from a top-down management style where they're asked to do the labor that makes the city function without feeling ownership over what decisions of what that labor looks like is going to be really critical moving forward. And then lastly, thinking of how that labor power can be harnessed towards broader solidarity goals. So knowing that city workers see the realities of both their working conditions, but also the lived conditions of Edmontonians, and really navigating and consolidating both labor goals and broader advocacy goals within the city in order to put pressure on all levels of government to try and transform the current conditions. So I know that I'm just about out of time, but thank you everyone for being here. And I guess I will pass it back to Jason for the Q&A.
Thank you, Inez, so much for that, for the summary of your report and the thoughtful recommendations that hopefully our decision makers will take seriously. So I want to open this up and spend, a little bit of time offering up, a question and answer period. People can ask some questions of the report and of Inez's thoughts on certain things. So some of you have figured it out. So good star, gold star for those of you who've already done it. But for those of you who haven't, the way that we're going to proceed with the Q&A is you could type your question into the little Q&A box. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a little box with a question mark in it that says Q&A. If you go in there, you'll be able to type your question. I'll then be able to see it. And so I will then attempt to sort of hopefully get to all of them, but if not, I'll try and sort through them as best and as equitably as I can to ask them to Inez, and obviously then she'll do her best to answer. And as I sort of scan in as the first few, some of them may be getting to a level of granularity and detail that you may or may not have gotten into in the report, but we'll give it a try and see. And obviously then if it is something that's just a little too granular, feel free to sort of acknowledge that and then answer as best you can. So we'll just kind of get them at the moment as we've got them. An anonymous attendee is saying, I wanted to know if the energy transition strategies are being implemented, as they also cut the budget and found out from other services, if you include frontline enforcement, that they cut services of CSPO or community service policing officers from 15 to 5. They also engage with the public and help with community support. Can you make a comment of the cuts and expenses are going up? They basically said, yeah, so that's kind of the core of the question. So it sounds like a lot about community policing and some of the energy transition strategies. I don't know if Inez, if you have some observations on that.
We didn't focus on that in the report, admittedly, and a lot of the specific budget adjustments have come out after this report was finalized. I don't know if you want me to answer from my own perspective or if that's something that you would like to address.
No, feel free.
In terms of the cuts being put forward, I think as we were writing the report, we were definitely anticipating that this is something that would occur. We didn't know what the budget adjustment would look like, but based on conversations that we were having and based off just like the situation that the city is in, which is, like recovering from a property tax freeze and then property tax rate increases below the amount required to sustain city services, the infrastructure gap, and just like the need for major investments into like high cost infrastructure. we knew that cuts were going to be inevitable, but I think that one of the concerns that I had when looking through the budget adjustments is thinking through like what, like who is intended to benefit from these cuts, because I don't think it's impossible to find efficiencies that are both valuable to residents and, can be a way of taking work off of city workers' plates in ways that make their work more manageable and make their expertise feel valued. So I know that's not a direct response to the question, but I think that knowing that cuts were on the table is something that I think like a lot of people were hoping to see, was that those cuts would be guided by the people doing the work and not a more top-down approach from like city administration, and not being done purely out of like this need to cut and to find ways to balance the budget, but really out of a more intentional approach of like, what can we do differently? What cuts today can effectively reduce spending in the future. So shifting from prevention away from reactive responses rather than cuts today that'll then, needed to be filled in the multi-year budget.
Great, thanks for Inez. I see what I'm going to do here is I see a couple of questions that kind of revolve around a similar topic, so I think I'll kind of bring them out together at the same time. That maybe you can answer them. I see a couple of questions that are kind of interested in having you follow up a little bit on your concept of the progressive property taxation. One just wants a little bit more detail about how it works and is asking if is it based on property values and income, and then we have another questioner saying what pathways do you see to being able to actually kind of lead to a progressive property tax policy? So maybe you can kind of tackle those as in tandem.
A progressive property tax essentially just refers to the property tax rate changing depending on a progressive factor. The reality is that the city can choose to go about it different ways. It can be done exclusively off the value of the property. So as the value goes up, people will pay a higher property tax rate. It can also be done according to or like paired with income levels, household wealth, and so on. There isn't like currently it's not possible to have a progressive property tax under the current Municipal Government Act. So reform to that legislation would be the first step. And then what that looks like can come in consultation with residents, so with property owners, and then also with renters, because while it's not as explicit, but renters, like as property tax goes up, rent also increases, and that cost is downloaded onto renters. So making sure that everybody has a say in these types of conversations is important, but it isn't predetermined that it has to be like tied exclusively to property value. Alternatively, something like a mansion tax is also a form of progressive property tax. So it doesn't necessarily have to look like, for every additional, and like these are completely fictional numbers, but like for every additional $100,000 that a house is valued at, the property tax raises on that amount. It can also look like, at a certain threshold, a secondary tax is incurred at property, like a secondary property tax is incurred on houses worth over a certain amount, or like the top percentage or like the most expensive properties in Edmonton. So how that actually looks is like very, very flexible and can be adjusted to meet and be relevant to an Edmonton context. Sorry, the second question being like in terms of what is the process that could be brought, that can be implemented through?
I think it was more what do you see as kind of a pathway to get us there? So like how could we actually sort of advocate to be able to make this a viable policy option?
Yeah, I think like there have been like to my understanding, there's been, requests at the city to like study and what kind, like I would say a first step is understanding like based on the different ways that tax can be implemented. So, like based on property value, a mansion tax, based on household wealth, and so on, having the city look into what kind of revenue that would generate, and what that would mean for the people that would pay this additional tax, I would say is an initial step. And then thinking of, advocacy at the provincial level to make the necessary amendments to the Municipal Government Act.
Great, thank you. I'm seeing a number of questions that are kind of revolving around issues of the developer agreements and revenue from development and priorities around development. So I'll kind of combine a couple. Um, One is kind of partly an observation that these developer agreement fees have been kind of stagnant despite the amount of, urban sprawl development we've been seeing in the city. So they're just kind of wondering why these fees aren't capturing the actual costs or the externalities of these sort of greenfield developments. Another question is asking what can be done to increase developer revenue. And then there was a suggestion in here, I'm just trying to find it quickly, about greenfield. I've lost it now at the moment. There's another one that was sort of talking about um, basically applying more of the costs of greenfield development to developers themselves. So I guess these are all just sort of questions, but maybe you could expand a little more about choices that the city of Edmonton has around issues of sprawl versus infill and what kind of levers they can use to try and either A, encourage more infill, and B, get more of the costs of greenfield development covered by private parties and private interests.
When we talk about development, I think it's essentially a conversation around power and who holds power at a city level, and where and how they're able to leverage it. So development, I think, generally encompasses like a large range of things. And we can think about how and what it means for developer and the developer industry to be able to control the narrative on the actions that they take. So a lot of pushback is going to come from developers around changes that are going to raise developer fees and that are like going to put more of the onus back onto the developers to actually funding the necessary infrastructure around new development. And the problem there is that developers are able to use their power and their leverage to essentially suggest or that they won't bring in those developments, that they will, like go elsewhere. And the problem with that is that leverage and that relationship to the city isn't necessarily as like clear cut as it looks. So, on one hand, the city can say like, no, we won't be approving new development permits in these certain areas. And like infill is required before expanding into new areas of the city. And at the same time, developers are able to leverage that and then suggest that like, then they won't develop at all. Part of the concern is that, developers are the ones that are primarily, like as it currently stands, the ones who are building housing. And a lot of this is going to be like private housing versus thinking of how the city can take that back in-house and start looking towards like social housing. That, however, is going to require like major support from other levels of government. I don't think it's realistic to suggest that the city could be able to meet those needs on their own. But also thinking of the ways that grassroots advocacy and also like people at the city councilors can try and take back that narrative. Oftentimes there'll be this framing that, like affordable housing isn't possible without developer interests and like urban expansion. And a lot of that is not factually true and is ways that the development industry uses their power to leverage people's fears around housing affordability, housing costs. And so making sure that there is that local pushback and ensuring that the information that's put out is factual and isn't just playing into people's concerns and anxieties around housing in the housing market.
Good. Just to bring us back to this question of progressive property taxes, there was a question that I think might be useful for you to answer kind of directly. Is it the question is it not more likely that more wealthy residents will quote unquote flee to surrounding municipalities and accelerate sprawl if property taxes are linked to income? So you might be able to want to respond to that directly.
In my opinion, and like from the research that I've read and understood, I would say no. I think that people, like for starters, people make choices around where they want to live for a variety of reasons. And it isn't necessarily entirely linked to property taxes. People choose to live in a place because of you know, like they like the neighborhood that they're in, they like the access to amenities that they have, they like the community that they're surrounded by. This is close to their work, it's close to family, it's close to, you know, like the the logic that informs why someone chooses to live in one place isn't as direct as, you know, like property taxes higher here than there. Based on, you know, what province you live in, people have different tax rates. And this isn't to say that everybody has left, you know, jurisdictions with higher tax rates. So I think it does like undermine what having a community brings to someone and why they would choose to stay in one place. The other reality is like the housing itself. So if you have property tax on house of a certain value or like income levels, like if one person were to leave, like what, unless like everybody were to leave and this area were to be empty, who, like the individual that pays that tax, um, isn't factored in. So like the revenue source comes from people that choose to live there. And I think that like if you have complete communities and you have good infrastructure, um, it's unrealistic to suggest that people aren't going to want to live there because of a tax rate.
Thanks. We've got a couple of questions of people kind of looking at this contentious issue, which you've probably heard about during your research in the last number of months about the provincial government reducing the amount of property taxes that they pay over previous years. So I guess there's just some questions around that and its impact on revenues. And then I think maybe this question in particular is there a way that the city can compel the provincial government to actually, you know, pay their taxes?
It's a challenging question because the city doesn't have like enforcement mechanisms that they have towards the province. Like it is generally the other way around. You hear it all the time, but this like municipalities are the creatures of the province. And essentially all that means is that municipalities are bound to provincial legislation and not the other way around. So the short answer is like no, other than like really severing ties with the province and not allowing for that kind of legislation. But Edmonton is the provincial capital. And so inevitably you're going to have provincial buildings. And, you know, like I wouldn't suggest that a further deterioration of that relationship is going to be helpful or beneficial in the short or long term. But I think like really important is then the role of residents and of advocacy at the provincial level, and like showing how that impacts. I think that there's a lot of potential for important like resident-based advocacy and grassroots advocacy that can have like important political implications.
Great. So just there was a question just sort of about sort of the work that you were doing in the researching the report. They were just wondering if when you were interviewing city workers, did they give you any examples of or ideas that they had about how you could, you know, have some cost savings and efficiencies without impacting services and you know, quality of services to Edmontonians?
Yeah, and I think one thing that came up a lot is that we spoke to union presidents and they had like a wealth of knowledge around like previous times where they have recommended something to the city that they felt, you know, would save money. And it took years to have that implemented. So in thinking of, I mean, the first one that comes to mind, just because snowing outside around like Christmas tree collection and no longer taking on that responsibility, and what it can mean in terms of cost savings for like waste management. And they shared like that that's something that they brought forward to the city like years and years in advance before it was finally implemented. I think something else that they were also able to point to over and over was examples of when they highlighted that cuts that the city was making were going to have like really detrimental impacts on service delivery and how residents experience that service. And we're then able to like then point to, you know, either like news articles or changes to those decisions where it became very clear that city workers had that input ahead of time. And it didn't have to be a situation where like, okay, well, we try something, we wait and see when we already have that knowledge. Something that also came up a lot was just the general frustration around like feeling that the city was blaming city workers for the financial difficulties. So that association that you'll see of like, property tax increase being then linked to wage increases and collective bargaining, but we don't actually see that. So in the report, there's a figure that essentially shows how revenues are being spent at a city level over time, and wages aren't growing as a percentage of spending. So there was a lot of like concrete ways that city workers were able to point to in terms of work that's being done that is either like brought on additional work. So like a lot of that like de facto social service work that's being done by transit workers is something that came up a lot as ways that there are preventative mechanisms, there are preventative solutions. There's lots of research and evidence around, alternatives and like poverty alleviation mechanisms that would take and essentially create efficiencies for transit workers by not having to do that additional work.
Thank you. Seeing a couple questions kind of revolving around issues of the unique nature of Edmonton's greater capital region. I'll read this one in verbatim because I think it has an interesting sort of thought. It said, the issue is that commercial property taxes are declining as a portion of our revenue, and they are going to lower tax jurisdictions outside the city. Yet the people who work there choose to live in our city, increasing the tax burden and lowering the revenue. Is there any way or example of regional cooperation where costs can be shared?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of an example of regional cooperation, but I wouldn't want to suggest that that's not something that's possible. I think it's also fair because we've seen it happen that, like a tax can be brought in Edmonton. And like, if it is beneficial, if there are equity impacts, it raises new sources of revenue. There's no reason that it wouldn't or it could not be brought in other areas. So also in terms of like paving the way to more equitable revenue generation mechanisms is a role that Edmonton can play. And maybe we'll be able to see that happening in other jurisdictions so that it won't be like, it's not such a stark difference of like, there are, these additional progressive property tax, for example, in Edmonton, and then not in neighboring jurisdictions. And I think that because it requires that legislation change at the provincial level, that's going to be true for other jurisdictions. So by creating a pathway, like showing that it's possible, showing the benefits of that happening, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration.
Great, thank you. And here's a question I think that kind of has some currency and some current relevancy. With Bill 18, the Provincial Priorities Act, restricting municipalities' ability to enter into funding agreements with or receive grant funding from the federal government, how can Edmonton find funding pathways for priorities that do not align with the provincial government of the day? Do you see this as having a big impact on city initiatives going forward?
I definitely see it as having a big big impact on the city moving forward. But I think that we've also seen like the importance of like political and media pressure in these cases. So the city being able to like being prevented from entering agreements with the federal government because of their current relationship with the provincial government, or like not having the same alignment from a political perspective with the provincial government, but being able to highlight to people what opportunities exist, like what kind of housing funding is available, infrastructure, transit funding, and so on, that could be brought in and could have direct impact on the lives of people in Edmonton. And then really putting pressure in terms of essentially incentivizing the provincial government to then enter those funding agreements. And we've seen it happen before, how like once those conversations go public and once, the way that the provincial government is restricting access to funding, like, I don't think it's impossible for that collaboration to happen. We've seen it happen before.
Thank you. This one's interesting. You can comment as you see fit. This participant says a significant part of the problem seems to be a culture of inefficiency and accountability. I'm assuming in the city, they're saying. A recent example is an Edmonton fire hall costing 3 times more than a similar one in Leduc. And the contracts for the Valley Line West would seem to be another example. And so their question is part of the problem a result of less experienced senior staff? Did you get anything in your research that gives you some insights into that?
I think to the specifics of like less experienced senior staff, like I don't know, like I wouldn't be able to comment on that based on not knowing the levels of experience of senior staff in other areas in Alberta. I think part of it is like something that's very like publicized is the turnover in senior staff in Edmonton. So like the change in city managers, the change in like high profile city roles. But I don't necessarily want to frame that as a negative thing because a lot of positive can come. I think like the recent like well, not appointment, but like the current city manager being brought on permanently rather than interim. I think we see a lot of hope in those changes and in like someone bringing a new and fresh perspective to the city. I definitely think though, a lot of that initial like frustration was coming from that top-down management style. And I think that that's where we see like costs going up because it's not going to be done like it's just not going to be the most effective management style because it's not somebody that has that day-to-day experience. And I think when workers aren't allowed to contribute to that long-term visioning, you know, they're expected to do the work but aren't allowed to really contribute to where they see like the direction of the work going. I think you're going to end up incurring additional costs because there's work that's going to happen that's going to be redundant. And you're going to bring on like additional frustration. And like a big thing, which isn't like directly related to like infrastructure costs, but when you have that kind of tension between your workers and administration, you're going to get high turnover. And so you start seeing staffing costs that are going to look like, you know, like training workers who then don't stay on long term. And so that's going to incur additional costs. You're also going to see a lot of burnout in your workers, and then like the remaining workers are going to have to make that up often through overtime. So you're going to see like less effective funding options by paying people for overtime, paying people to train, and then not stay on long term. And so like your operating costs are going to also be like ineffectively spent when you're not like when workers aren't being retained and they're not feeling valued in their roles.
I think we might have time for one last question. Someone's just asking if there are examples from other cities of creative forms of revenue generation, of finding new pathways to finding revenue streams for the city.
And like there is like very differing opinions on what that can look like. But there are cities that incur like significantly more debt than the city of Edmonton, so that borrow a lot more for infrastructure growth. There are also cities that have different tax structures. So thinking of like land transfer tax, which I know are like rather and like can be rather controversial, but like thinking of like cities like Toronto that have those taxes. I think another area and like this is not necessarily a way of raising revenue, but of moving funding from within the budget. So I think we do see cities that are taking on, or at least piloting preventive responses to like at least like one of the main areas that we see this is in mental health crisis response. So shifting away from more reactive services and then seeing that lead to a reduced need for, and like ideally a reduction in funding for responsive services that are then getting back to like core responsibilities. So thinking of a service like the fire department, really focusing that towards like fire prevention and response and shifting away from that more crisis response role that they're taking on like overwhelmingly in terms of the numbers of calls that they get, I think are other like creative solutions that the city can look towards.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Inez, for all of those thorough answers to the questions. I know it was quite a grab bag of stuff. So thank you. I want to thank you, Inez, so much for doing this webinar and obviously the report that it's based upon. Appreciate your time and your expertise, and you're willing to engage with the Parkland audience. I very much want to thank you for that on behalf of Parkland. And I want to thank everybody who attended this afternoon. I mean, I think this is an important topic, and so I'm glad so many of you came and spent a little bit of time doing that. I want to remind all of you, if you are interested in getting some of the details behind Inez's presentation today, you can get a copy of the full report for free at parklandinstitute.ca. Also, we're always interested in feedback from participants, so often we'd like to hear your feedback about how you thought the webinar went. You can do that at parkland@ualberta.ca. And then finally, if you like the work of this report and the other work that Parkland does, please consider donating and becoming a supporter of Parkland Institute. We receive no government money. These reports are all done by this money that we can raise from our supporters to be able to make happen. So if you want to see more of this kind of work, please come and go to parklandinstitute.ca and offer up some money as well. So once again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.